What if someone could take you back to the final moments before General Custer met his tragic fate? Theodore W. Golden, a soldier of the 7th Cavalry, held such a secret, one he revealed only decades later. As one of the last to see Custer alive, Golden's letter paints a vivid picture of the tensions, decisions, and haunting warnings leading up to the Battle of Little Bighorn. What did he witness? How might it change history? Join us as we unravel Golden's hidden account and uncover the untold truths. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and be part of this journey into history. Theodore W. Golden, a former member of the 7th Cavalry, holds a rare distinction. He was among the last individuals to see General George Armstrong Custer alive. Golden's account, preserved in a letter written in 1904, provides an invaluable first-hand perspective on the events leading up to Custer's tragic demise at the Battle of Little Bighorn. His testimony offers a window into a pivotal moment in American history, and its importance cannot be overstated. Golden's 1904 letter serves as a time capsule, detailing his memories of Custer and the regiment. In the letter, addressed to an unnamed correspondent who had inquired about Custer's last battle, Golden reflects on his years with the 7th Cavalry and his personal interactions with the general. He humbly notes that the passage of time may have blurred some details, but expresses his eagerness to share his recollections. He also commends his correspondent's commitment to preserving these stories in book form, acknowledging the vital role of such works in keeping history alive. Golden joined the 7th Cavalry in 1907, 873, a time when tensions between the U.S. Army and various Native American tribes were escalating. His years of service brought him into close contact with General Custer, whom he describes with admiration, underscoring the general's charisma and leadership. Golden recalls that his regiment's activities were disrupted briefly in 1607, 875, when his troop was reassigned to the southern states. But his service alongside Custer resumed shortly after. By early 1876, the stage was set for what would become one of the most infamous military engagements in U.S. history. Golden recounts how the regiment received orders for a major campaign against the Sioux, a plan involving 3 sizable military columns. This campaign was designed to suppress the growing resistance among Native American tribes, who were increasingly unwilling to cede their lands and way of life. Golden vividly describes the regiment's journey from Shreveport, Louisiana, to Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory, where preparations for the campaign intensified. The movement was not just logistical, but symbolic, marking the escalation of a conflict that would culminate in the dramatic events of Little Bighorn. Golden's narrative begins to hint at the tensions and challenges that would define the expedition, from logistical complexities to the psychological strain on soldiers preparing for an uncertain confrontation. Golden's letter is more than a mere recollection. It is a poignant reflection on the camaraderie and shared hardships of the men under Custer's command. Through his words, readers gain a deeper appreciation of the human element in these historic events, a blend of admiration for Custer's leadership and the sobering recognition of the tragedy that lay ahead. Golden's testimony remains a cornerstone for historians seeking to understand not only the Battle of Little Bighorn, but also the individuals who lived and fought in its shadow. General Custer rejoined our unit just days before we departed, having been occupied with an investigating committee in Washington. His late arrival set a certain tone for the campaign, one of urgency and complexity. I recall the regiment's preparations as we moved out from Fort Lincoln toward the Yellowstone River. The specifics of that march blur in my memory, as my own journey was interrupted when I was unexpectedly arrested in Chicago while traveling from Washington. My absence during this portion of the journey perhaps highlights the intricate web of logistics and personal fates that that defined such military campaigns. By the time we reached the vicinity of the Powder River, close to its mouth, the regiment had settled into a temporary supply camp. It had been decided earlier to leave behind our carts and establish a base of operations for greater mobility. During these days, we worked tirelessly outfitting our packed train, ensuring we were ready for the challenging terrain and hostile conditions that awaited us. Around this time, Major Reno had embarked on a scouting expedition ahead of the main column. His mission was to reconnoiter the area and rendezvous with us near the mouth of the Tongue River on June 17. True to schedule, our regiment advanced to this location, setting up camp on the same day. That date stands out in my memory, not only because of our movements, but also because it was the day General Crook engaged in a bloody battle with native forces on the Rosebud River. Though distant from our position, the clash served as a stark reminder of the gravity of our mission. At Powder River, we made further strategic adjustments. The wagon train, dismounted recruits, and even the regimental band were left behind to streamline our operations. Every decision was calculated to maximize our speed and efficiency. I recall how the soldiers, myself included, constantly scanned the riverbed for distant dust clouds. Each movement on the horizon sparked hope that Reno's command was nearing. Yet, as the hours passed without word from him, we set up camp again on June 18. The following day, shortly after midday, Reno finally rejoined us, delivering his report. It was at this juncture that I noticed a marked change in General Custer. Normally confident and composed, he seemed unusually irritable and restless. His typical decisiveness appeared tempered by an undercurrent of anxiety. The contents of Reno's report seemed to trigger a shift in his demeanor. Without hesitation, he rallied the regiment into marching formation and ordered an advance toward the Rosebud River. We knew that General Terry had already gone ahead aboard the supply steamer Far West, hoping to coordinate with General Gibbon's forces. Our objective was clear: to move swiftly and decisively. Custer, now exhibiting flashes of his characteristic energy, seemed fully focused on the mission. The urgency of his commands left no room for hesitation, and we pressed forward, unaware of the fateful encounter awaiting us in the days ahead. This sequence of events, etched in my memory, underscores the tension and unpredictability of that campaign, a prelude to the tragedy that would soon unfold. General Custer's characteristic zeal and decisiveness were evident as we pressed forward with urgency. Our march continued late into the night, a grueling but focused advance that eventually brought us to the Yellowstone River. Upon arrival, we set up camp with confidence, believing we would intercept the steamer if it was navigating below our position. The following morning, we resumed our march early, and soon spotted the Far West steamer, along with General Gibbon's wagon train moving upriver. The sight of their progress reinforced our sense of coordination and purpose. Couriers soon arrived with critical news from Major Reno, reporting the discovery of a significant Indian trail. Acting on this information, we established a new camp near the mouth of the Rosebud River. It was here that a council of war was convened to carefully analyze Reno's findings. This meeting marked a pivotal moment, as preparations for what would become a robust campaign intensified the next day. I vividly recall the final meeting held aboard the steamer on the evening of June 21 Street. General Custer received his last set of orders during this session. General Gibbon expressed concerns about logistical constraints, stating that his forces would not be able to reach the mouth of the Little Bighorn River by noon on June 26, as previously planned. Discussions then turned to the offer of reinforcements, specifically the 2nd Cavalry Battalion and an artillery detachment, both of which had been shipped aboard the steamer. To the surprise of some, General Custer declined the additional support, explaining that he trusted the capabilities of his current command, and feared that the artillery would slow their advance in the challenging terrain and in close proximity to the enemy. This decision sparked quiet speculation among officers and troops. Some believed that Custer's choice aligned with a long-standing desire for autonomous command, a preference he had demonstrated in prior campaigns. Despite these murmurs, his request was approved, and the regiment moved forward with unwavering focus. The next significant moment occurred on the afternoon of June 22 when we paraded before Generals Terry and Gibbon, symbolizing our readiness to execute the mission. Following this formal display, we began the advance along the path Major Reno had scouted. The trail, marked by Reno's earlier observations, led us deeper into the territory, with progress interrupted only by brief stops to establish suitable campsites. However, an unsettling oversight occurred during this period. Despite the presence of George Herendeen, a scout assigned specifically to our command, no efforts were made to thoroughly survey the surrounding area or dispatch messengers to General Gibbon, as protocol would have dictated. This failure to communicate and gather intelligence highlighted a lapse in strategic discipline, a deviation that would later bear significant consequences. These events, etched deeply into my memory, reflected a mix of determination and missteps as we marched closer to the fateful confrontation. The decisions made during these days, particularly General Custer's reliance on his own command, shaped the final course of our expedition. The pace of our march remained relentless up until the evening of June 24th. Though it appeared that we were settling in for the night, this was a deliberate maneuver. We had been ordered to stay mounted and prepared for a night march, a strategy designed to deceive the Indians into thinking we had halted. The tactic revealed the calculated nature of our operations. Yet beneath the surface, there was an undeniable urgency. General Custer's demeanor underwent a noticeable transformation as we departed from the Rosebud. His erratic energy, evident earlier in the campaign, gave way to a singular focus on reaching and confronting the Indian forces. His sharp attention to detail and decisive actions stood in contrast to his previous bouts of restlessness. The change was palpable, and it galvanized the regiment for the challenges ahead. The trail we followed bore significant implications. It originated from the Missouri River and, based on the estimations of Bloody Knife, our Arikara scout, and our Crow allies, indicated the presence of a large Indian force. Their calculations suggested a band of 1,000 to 1,200 warriors, almost exclusively fighting men from the Missouri River agencies. This intelligence underscored the scale of the confrontation we were approaching and added a layer of tension to every decision made. Around 11 o'clock that evening, the order came to mount and line up. As we prepared to move, a contingent of scouts, including Crows, Reese, and several officers, such as Lieutenants Varnum and Hare, pushed forward to assess the trail ahead. Their task was to scout the divide and locate the Indian encampment. The rest of us left our bivouac and advanced cautiously, aiming to reach the Little Bighorn foothills before dawn. The terrain proved more treacherous than anticipated. By daybreak, we found ourselves in a ravine at the base of high bluffs, still unsure of our proximity to the river. The rough landscape and difficulties in scouting had hindered our progress. The uncertainty of our location weighed heavily on us, but it was soon overshadowed by reports from the scouts. General Custer, who had joined the scouting party during the night, was informed just after dawn that the settlement had been located in the Little Bighorn Valley. However, his reaction was one of skepticism. He reportedly voiced doubts about the accuracy of the scouts' findings, a hesitation that seemed at odds with the immediacy of the situation. Our position was further compromised when a detachment sent to retrieve a misplaced box of ammunition encountered Indians attempting to open it. The box, it turned out, contained hardtack rather than ordnance. But the discovery was significant. It was now clear that our presence in the area had been detected. This revelation added a new layer of urgency to our movements. General Custer quickly decided on an advance. The decision was met with cautionary advice from Mitch Bowie, a half-Crow translator, who warned that the valley held more warriors than Custer's command could handle. Bowie's warning was stark. Should they enter the valley, neither he nor Custer would leave it alive. In response, Custer dismissed the caution, asking Bowie if he was afraid to proceed. Bowie's reply was resolute. He would follow Custer anywhere, but his warning remained steadfast. This moment, marked by conflicting perspectives and unwavering determination, encapsulated the high-stakes nature of the campaign. Every decision carried profound consequences, and the path forward seemed to narrow with each passing hour. The next phase of the march would bring us closer to a confrontation that, even in its prelude, was defined by tension, bravery, and ominous forewarnings. Just before the command advanced, I received orders from Lieutenant Mackintosh to report directly to General Custer for duty as an orderly. Without delay, I complied, and upon my arrival, the general assigned me to ride alongside our regimental adjutant, Lieutenant Cook, to assist with any tasks he might require. As we prepared for the next stage of the march, I observed the men around me, most of them sprawled on the ground during the brief stop. They appeared exhausted, many dozing where they lay, while the horses grazed idly in the sagebrush. A brief respite before the inevitable resumption of movement. General Custer then issued the order to advance, instructing each battalion's first ready company to shift to the right of the line. The efficiency of the soldiers was remarkable. Within minutes, every man was mounted, and the battalions were ready to move. Meanwhile, Bentine's battalion received specific orders to advance to the left. His task was to scout the area thoroughly, drive out any Indians in his path, and report any findings back to the main command. This division of roles demonstrated the calculated nature of Custer's strategy, aimed at maximizing reconnaissance and control over the terrain. Leading 5 battalions, General Custer took the right flank, while McDougal was left in charge of the crowded train, tasked with following the trail as best he could. Major Reno's command moved forward along the main trail, tasked with pursuing the primary path toward the suspected Indian encampment. These clear, segmented instructions set the stage for the next phase of the operation. As soon as these commands were issued, the entire column moved into the line of march. Within a short time, we came upon Reno's contingent, which was pressing forward as quickly as the challenging terrain permitted. The ascent was grueling, with loose rocks and uneven ground slowing the pace. At one point, the rugged conditions forced General Custer's column to diverge to the left, creating a temporary separation between units. After a prolonged climb, we reached the summit of a ridge, offering a sweeping view of the surrounding landscape. The sight was both breathtaking and foreboding. Ahead of us stretched a plateau, sloping gently toward the foothills of the river, approximately 5 or 6 kilometers in the distance. From this vantage point, the strategic layout of our forces became clear. Bentine's command was visible several miles to the left, diligently scouting the bluffs as instructed. Reno's column was also in sight, further along the main trail, and descending rapidly toward the valley. Despite the physical separation of our units, there was a sense of cohesion in our overall movements. While we remained far to Reno's right, our path largely mirrored his, maintaining a general alignment as we progressed. The carefully coordinated approach reflected Custer's focus on strategy, balancing the need for rapid movement with a division of forces to cover more ground. The ridge summit marked a critical point in our march. It provided not only a tactical overview of our surroundings, but also a moment of reflection on the complexity of our advance. Every battalion had a role to play, and the unfolding sequence of maneuvers underscored the layered nature of Custer's strategy. Yet, beneath this sense of order, the looming uncertainty of what lay ahead was palpable, a silent tension that would only deepen as we descended toward the valley. This stage of the campaign revealed much about Custer's command style, decisive, methodical, and adaptive to the landscape. As I followed his orders and observed the regiment's movements, I could not help but sense the weight of the mission ahead, a weight that seemed to settle on every soldier in the column. As we pressed forward, General Custer's movements became increasingly erratic. He would spur his horse ahead of the column, only to halt and wait impatiently for the rest of us to catch up before charging forward again. To those of us near him, it was evident that he was growing restless with our pace, as though the urgency of the mission had outpaced the physical limitations of his men and horses. His impatience was palpable, a reflection of his determination to press on, despite the challenges of the terrain and the looming uncertainty of the situation. At one point during the march, we noticed a large dust cloud traveling along the river valley. Its cause was unclear, and the uncertainty of its origin heightened the tension among the troops. While the rest of us held our positions, Custer, accompanied only by his trusted trumpeter, rode out toward the river. He climbed to the top of a tall cliff, where we observed him raise his hat in the air, as though saluting a distant figure. The significance of this gesture was unclear, and it only added to the enigmatic nature of the moment. Custer soon returned to the head of the column, this time under the leadership of Captain Miles Keogh and I Troop. Keogh's reputation as a seasoned officer, who had seen many battles, instilled confidence in those of us following their lead. As Custer rode alongside Keogh, his excitement was unmistakable. "Those Indians are running," he declared, his eyes bright with determination. "We can afford to sacrifice half of the command's horses if we can continue the chase." Keogh, maintaining his composure, turned in his saddle to address the column. "General, we shall do all that man and horse can do," he responded with calm resolve, his demeanor reminiscent of a parade ground officer rather than one preparing for combat. Shortly after, the bugle sounded, signaling a charge. It was the first we had heard since departing the Rosebud, and it sent a wave of adrenaline through the ranks. We thundered north down the river in a determined attempt to descend into the valley, but the terrain proved insurmountable. After multiple failed attempts to navigate the steep slopes, Custer was forced to reconsider. After what seemed to be the third failed attempt to descend, Custer paused to confer briefly with Captain Cook. Their conversation was quick and urgent. Captain Cook, always efficient, produced a notepad, jotted down a message, and called for an orderly. As the first to respond, I was handed the folded paper. Cook instructed me, "Hand this off to Major Reno. Stay with him until we reach a junction, and then immediately report back to me." Without further explanation, he disappeared into the chaos of the advancing column. For a moment, I stood alone, watching as the rear of the column surged past and vanished into the dense brush ahead. It was then that the gravity of my situation became clear. I was alone in hostile terrain. Wasting no time, I mounted my horse and rode toward Reno's command. The only guide I had was the persistent dust cloud, marking their location in the distance. The ride to Reno's position was tense, but I encountered little direct resistance. A few scattered bullets were fired in my direction, but their aim was long and inaccurate. If anything, the sporadic gunfire served as a motivator, pushing me to reach Reno's command more quickly. As I approached, I could see the dust cloud settle around their position, signaling that I had found the right path. The sequence of events that unfolded during this march underscored the intensity of the situation. Custer's impatience, the attempts to descend into the valley, and the hurried communication with Reno's forces all revealed the mounting pressure on the command. Even in the face of obstacles, Custer's determination was unrelenting. driving the regiment closer to the fateful confrontation that awaited us in the valley below. Each decision, each movement, felt like a prelude to the tragedy that would soon engulf us. When I arrived at Major Reno's position, after a grueling 6-mile ride, I found him in the midst of dismounting his men to engage the enemy on foot. I delivered my message without knowing its contents. Reno took a brief glance at the note, folded it, and tucked it into his pocket without a word. The situation around us was rapidly deteriorating. Panic had set in among the Re-Scouts, who fled in fear, retreating all the way to the safety of the Powder River and the wagon train. Their departure marked a critical moment, leaving Reno's command exposed as the Indians began to encircle us. From my vantage point, I saw the enemy advancing swiftly, surrounding us from behind. Their approach was methodical, and their arrows and bullets soon found their mark. Several of our horses were struck, and chaos ensued as others stampeded, adding to the growing disorder in our ranks. With no choice but to fall back, we turned toward the timberline, attempting to hold our position long enough to regroup. Reaching the shelter of the woods, we found temporary relief in the cover provided by the dense timber and the nearby riverbank. The change in terrain allowed us to mount a more effective resistance against the encroaching enemy. For a brief time, we were able to hold our ground, returning fire with some degree of success. Amid the fray, I spotted Captain Moylan organizing his troops, preparing them for another push. His presence, calm yet commanding, offered a glimmer of hope in the chaos. Standing nearby on the skirmish line, I overheard Lieutenant Wallace calling out to Captain French, who was leading the center company, asking for instructions. French's reply revealed the precariousness of our situation. He had not received any orders. Nevertheless, he resolved to act decisively, stating that, regardless of direction, he was certain a charge was imminent. Moments later, French called out to us to prepare for a mounted charge. As we scrambled to mount up, the scene became even more chaotic. Heavy gunfire and the stampede of frightened horses left about 15 of our men dismounted, vulnerable in the midst of the skirmish. Among them was Trooper McCormick, who, with a resigned tone, declared, "We're all doomed anyhow. I might as well die on foot as on horseback." His words, though grim, encapsulated the desperation many of us felt in that moment. Lieutenant Mackintosh, having lost his own horse, commandeered another in a desperate bid to stay in the fight. What happened next took us all by surprise. As we swung into the saddle, expecting to charge the advancing Indians, we instead saw Reno leading his men in a swift maneuver up the cliffs on the opposite side of the river. This unexpected retreat turned the situation into a frantic stampede as the Indians quickly regrouped, flanking us and opening fire on our exposed column. Their marksmanship, fortunately, was poor, and despite the disarray, our casualties during the retreat were relatively minor. Rumors later circulated about Reno's behavior during this chaotic withdrawal. Some claimed that he had become so agitated that he fired his revolver at the Indians until it was empty, then discarded the weapon in frustration. However, I can personally refute this story. To my knowledge, the revolver in question was later accounted for in the possession of General Bentine's family, disproving the claim that Reno had thrown it away in a moment of desperation. As we fled, I found myself riding along the timberline on the left flank of the column. It was here that my horse suddenly stumbled and crashed to the ground, throwing me headlong into a patch of sagebrush. For a moment, I lay stunned, trying to make sense of the chaos around me. The ground was rough, and I could feel cuts and bruises forming, though thankfully, my injuries were not severe. Scrambling to my feet, I realized the danger of my position. I was alone, dismounted, and in hostile territory, with the enemy still pursuing us. The retreat from Reno's position was one of the most harrowing moments I experienced during the campaign. The combination of confusion desperation, and disorganized leadership underscored the precariousness of our situation. Despite the temporary relief offered by the timber and the determination of officers like Moylan and French, the day's events revealed the vulnerabilities in our command and the relentless pressure of the enemy's assault. Reno's actions, though divisive in their interpretation, were part of a desperate attempt to preserve what remained of his force. As the Indians closed in, each of us could only focus on surviving the chaos that had engulfed us. The chaos of the retreat left me momentarily dazed, but fortunate to have suffered only minor wounds, mostly to my face. As I struggled to regain my footing, Lieutenant Wallace galloped past me, shouting a warning, "Flee to the timber! Your horse is dead!" His words struck me with urgency, and I instinctively followed his advice, running toward the timberline with as few pauses as I could manage. My heart pounded as I sprinted, not daring to confirm Wallace's grim account, but trusting his judgment. Fortunately, I reached the safety of the woods unscathed, where I collapsed behind cover, trying to catch my breath. From my hiding spot, I observed the tumultuous scene unfolding around the creek. Our troops were forcing their horses across the rocky, fast-moving waters, urging them into the boulder-strewn current with shouts and desperate movements. Among them, Lieutenant Hodgson caught my attention. It was clear that he was injured. His movements were labored, and his horse seemed unsteady as it leapt into the creek. Despite his predicament, Hodgson managed to escape the stirrups and grabbed the stirrup strap of a passing trooper's horse to aid his crossing. When Hodgson finally reached the opposite bank, his condition was unmistakable. He was hurt, yet his resolve was unbroken. A nearby trooper attempted to assist him onto a saddle, but the sheer urgency of the moment and the pressure of the ongoing retreat made the task perilous. The trooper, evidently fearful of stopping his own horse in the open, hesitated, leaving Hodgson to fend for himself. As Hodgson tried to move forward, the situation took a tragic turn. He was struck again, this time visibly recoiling as he lost his grip and collapsed to the ground. Still, he displayed remarkable determination, struggling to his feet and staggering forward a few paces. Desperately, he called out for help, and another soldier made a brave attempt to assist him. Yet, just as it seemed Hodgson might be spared, the assisting trooper swayed in his saddle and fell heavily to the ground, also hit by enemy fire. With his chances of retreat diminishing, Hodgson's resolve hardened. He staggered a few more steps toward the gully, where our command was disappearing, only to falter once again. Realizing the futility of continuing, he turned back toward the pursuing Indians. Drawing his revolver, he fired with defiance, determined to fight to the end. From my position on the other side of the river, I heard 3 or 4 sharp gunshots ring out. Moments later, Hodgson fell to the ground and reeled, his fate tragically sealed. While this grim episode played out, most of our troops managed to cross the river and climb the nearby gully to relative safety. Yet I remained alone, crouched in my concealed spot, unsure of what lay ahead. As the Indians turned their attention to stripping and disfiguring the bodies of our fallen comrades along the riverbank, I found myself, remarkably, unobserved and unmolested. This brief reprieve allowed me to reflect on the dire circumstances surrounding us. The horrifying sight of the mutilation of our dead only deepened the despair of the moment. In the distance, the sounds of battle echoed faintly downriver. Distant gunfire that I presumed to be Custer and his men engaged with the enemy. The ferocity of the noise suggested an intense fight, and I feared that his command was facing overwhelming odds, much like we had been. My earlier observations of the area made it clear that we were significantly outnumbered, and I could only imagine the difficulty Custer's forces were enduring. Suddenly, I noticed a shift in the enemy's behavior. The majority of the Indians in our immediate vicinity began to scatter, moving hurriedly toward the lower part of the village. Their movement suggested an intent to join their fellow warriors, leaving our battered remnants momentarily free from their relentless pursuit. This reprieve allowed me a chance to assess my position and determine my next move, though the sense of unease and uncertainty about what lay ahead never left me. These moments, etched into my memory, revealed not only the chaos and desperation of the retreat, but also the remarkable bravery displayed by men like Hodgson. His final stand, though tragic, exemplified the courage and determination that marked our doomed expedition. As I crouched alone in the timber, the sounds of distant gunfire reminded me that our fight was far from over, and the weight of the unfolding tragedy settled heavily upon me. In the midst of the chaos, I spotted George Herendeen, the scout, nearby. Relief surged through me as I called out to him, grateful for a familiar face amid the uncertainty. We quickly regrouped, and Herendeen informed me about a group of 15 dismounted men from our command, who had managed to find temporary refuge in the woods about 200 yards away. Their position, however, was precarious. When they attempted to cross the open terrain to reach the river, they were met with Indian gunfire. Adding to the danger, the Indians had set fire to the riverbed before retreating, creating a smoldering barrier that served dual purposes. The smoke obscured their movements as they withdrew, and seemed intended to flush out any wounded men who might be hiding. Paradoxically, this very smoke became a lifeline for us. Using it as cover, Herendeen and I cautiously made our way toward the river, evading enemy fire and the watchful eyes of their remaining scouts. Crossing the river proved to be a difficult and nerve-wracking endeavor. The current was strong, the terrain treacherous, and our footing uncertain. Nevertheless, we persevered and reached the other side. There, we encountered one of our Crow scouts, whose presence was both reassuring and essential. With his guidance, we were able to navigate through the terrain and reconnect with the main command. The relief of rejoining our comrades after such an ordeal was profound, though our thoughts were still clouded with uncertainty about the larger situation. Upon our arrival, we learned that Benteen's battalion had successfully linked up with the command. However, there was still no word on General Custer's position or his fate. The absence of any news from Custer was a heavy burden, fueling both worry and speculation among the men. As we tried to regroup and share what we had seen, our attention was drawn to an unexpected sight, a white flag waving from the river bottom, close to the area where Herendeen and I had sought refuge earlier. Its presence suggested that there were still men below, attempting to signal for help. Lieutenant Hare, demonstrating extraordinary courage, volunteered to crawl to a vantage point on the bluffs to assess the situation. Risking his life, he determined that the group below consisted of the dismounted men who had been left behind during Reno's retreat. Their crossing was harrowing, but they eventually managed to join our ranks, bringing with them stories of survival and resilience. Amid these events, I couldn't help but recall the image of Lieutenant Mackintosh during our retreat. I had observed him riding ahead of me, mounted on McCormick's horse. His situation was precarious. His lariat had come loose, dragging behind him and catching on sagebrush and other obstacles. This created a dangerous situation, as the picket pin at the end of the lariat struck against the ground and vegetation, increasing the risk of a fall. Several men called out warnings to Mackintosh, urging him to address the issue, but he seemed either unaware or unconcerned. Moments later, the inevitable happened. His horse stumbled and fell, throwing Mackintosh to the ground. I passed by the scene, but couldn't determine if he had been struck by enemy fire, or if the fall itself had incapacitated him. He lay motionless, either dazed or worse, and the uncertainty of his condition weighed heavily on me. As I continued forward, these moments, though fleeting, captured the precariousness of our situation. The disarray of the retreat, the bravery of men like Lieutenant Hare and the Crow Scout, and the somber fate of Mackintosh all illustrated the complexities and dangers we faced. Despite the small victories of reconnecting with our command and recovering the dismounted men, the uncertainty surrounding Custer and the losses we had already endured cast a shadow over every step forward. The day was far from over, and the weight of what had already transpired bore down on us as we braced for what lay ahead. The following day, when the Indians had finally withdrawn, we ventured cautiously across the battlefield. It was then that we discovered Lieutenant Mackintosh, lying exactly where we had seen him fall. His still form and the undisturbed surroundings confirmed what we feared. He had succumbed to his fate. The sight was sobering, a stark reminder of the brutal toll the battle had exacted on our men. As I stood on the cliffs, overlooking the valley below, my attention was drawn to a heated exchange nearby. Captain Weir, his voice tinged with frustration and defiance, declared, "By God, I will go if you won't, and if we ever get out of this situation, someone will have to pay the price." With that, he strode off, determined to take action. His resolve seemed to galvanize the others. I watched as D Troop rose and moved toward the distant sound of gunfire, their formation loose but purposeful. The response from the rest of the command was less organized, apart from the steady ranks maintained by Bentin's and Godfrey's troops. The majority of the soldiers seemed to follow Weir's lead without explicit orders. We descended into the valley, the terrain pulling us toward Weir's position. When we finally reached his company, it was clear they had been overrun. The enemy forces they faced were far greater in number, and their retreat was already underway. With urgency, we formed a defensive line to block the pursuing Indian forces and give Weir's men the opportunity to regroup behind us. The maneuver succeeded, and with their assistance, we pivoted to establish a stronger position. It was during this chaotic retreat that Colonel Bentin's leadership became evident. He turned to Lieutenant Wallace and, with a firm resolve, said, "William, there's no use falling back further. We'll take a stand once your troops are assembled, with your right flank anchored here." Wallace's response carried a sardonic humor that seemed to lighten the grim moment. "I haven't a troop, only 2 men," he replied with a smirk. Without missing a beat, Bentin retorted, "Form yourself and your 2 men, and I'll tell you of our situation once I've ascertained it myself," punctuating his words with a grim laugh. Despite the small number of men, this tiny group became the foundation of our defense. As the hours passed, more soldiers joined our ranks. Using sagebrush and whatever materials we could find, we hastily built improvised barricades and began returning fire. The intensity of the skirmishes continued until midnight, when the welcome cover of darkness finally gave us a moment to breathe. Under the veil of night, we repositioned ourselves, established a makeshift hospital and corral, and fortified our defenses for the inevitable daylight assault. The fighting resumed at dawn with unrelenting ferocity. It wasn't until around 3 in the afternoon that we noticed a shift. The Indians, without warning, began packing their travois, dismantling their teepees, and retreating up the river valley. Their departure was frustratingly out of rifle range, leaving us unable to engage them further. Volunteer groups ventured out twice during the afternoon to fetch water, both times braving enemy fire. One of these excursions ended tragically for Madden of K Troop. He suffered a severe leg wound that required immediate attention. His injury was significant enough to necessitate amputation, which was performed later that evening after we managed to transport him to the hospital. The sight of his suffering and the courage he displayed added another layer of somber resolve to our already weary spirits. Relief arrived the next day when General Terry and General Gibbon reached our position. Their presence brought much-needed reinforcement and news of our comrades in the other battalion. The information they shared confirmed our worst fears about Custer's fate. With their assistance, we moved our injured across the river and prepared for one of the most harrowing tasks yet, returning to the battlefield on the 28th to bury our fallen. What we found was devastating. The remains of Custer's men lay scattered across the battlefield. Very few bodies were left unmutilated, save for General Custer himself. It was clear that the Indians had inflicted their vengeance on the fallen. However, I noted with some relief that our slain commanders had been spared this grim fate, their bodies left untouched in a rare show of respect or restraint. The horrors of that day are etched into my memory. Each burial felt like an acknowledgement of the ultimate sacrifice these men had made. Though the battle was over, its echoes lingered in the shattered landscape and the hearts of those who survived. This story, one of resilience, sacrifice, and grim determination, is a chapter in our shared history that must not be forgotten. To hear more first-hand accounts and explore untold stories like this one, make sure to follow our channel. Join us as we continue to uncover and honor the legacy of those who shaped the past.